Chloe Cole decided that she wanted to be a boy. At 13, she started puberty blockers and testosterone. And only 2 years later, she had a double mastectomy. But at 16, she regretted her life-changing decisions. The professionals who are meant to protect her actually encouraged the irreversible harm. Now, she has to live with the decisions she made as a child for the rest of her life. Brave Chloe is sharing her story because there are serious lessons to be learned from what has been done to her. So, Chloe, thank you so much for letting me turn on the cameras here in my office. We're having a fascinating conversation about your experience. So, welcome to PragerU.
Thank you for having me.
Your story is so fascinating. You started as a young girl who then decided that you were born in the wrong body. You transitioned from being a girl to a boy and ultimately changed your mind and realized that so much was thrown onto your plate at a very early age. And so I want to hear your story and how everything just got started.
I've got 2 older sisters, 2 older brothers, all half siblings from both sides, and they're all older than me. So I did have a bit of influence from them growing up, and because of my older sisters, I liked wearing dresses and skirts and pink and purple and things like that, and playing with Barbies and Bratz. But for my older brothers, I also had a bit of a tomboyish streak. Like I liked playing video games with them, and I liked playing with their Legos and toy guns and things like that.
At what point did you feel like you were a boy?
I am also on the spectrum, and growing up I did have some difficulties with socializing, especially with other girls my age. I didn't really fit in with them so much as I did with the boys. And when I was younger, this didn't really bother me, but as I got older and I hit puberty and got into middle school and socializing got more cliquey and gender oriented, I started to wonder if there was something wrong with me, and I didn't know what was separating me from these other girls and why I was different from them. When I was 11, I started using social media.
Is it from Instagram that you came up with the idea that you're possibly born in the wrong body?
As I started to use it more and more often, I was being exposed to images of other young women who they're very pretty, very, very idealized, and oftentimes they wore a lot of makeup or skimpy clothing, or they had they're editing their photos, or they had plastic surgery, and they were fitting this ideal of soft features, soft faces, thick, curvy. I started to wonder why don't I look like this? Is there something wrong with me? I was kind of a bit of a tomboy, and I was on the slightly more athletic side, and I had bigger shoulders, not very developed hips or breasts, and I did have a little bit of muscle in my body, and it was why can't I look like them? I feel like I look like a boy more than anything, and I started to feel I'll never be pretty as a girl. Why bother? Maybe I just look better as a boy. Roughly around the same time, I also started to see a lot of LGBTQ focused content, especially of people identified as non-binary or transgender, especially. And it was most often other girls my age, aged 12 to maybe their mid-20s. A lot of them were pretty tomboyish. A lot of them were very nerdy and just didn't really fit in with other girls.
You were searching for kind of a social community and you found a home with them?
Yeah. And I wasn't really directly involved in the community, but after being exposed to this content for some time, it was only natural that I started to ponder my own identity, who am I attracted to? What is my gender identity? Am I even a girl? And because I never really fit in with other girls my age, and I started to feel maybe I'm just not a girl. Maybe I'm just a boy.
Did you come up with the conclusion that you're a boy on your own?
Yeah.
Eventually? Yeah.
Nobody really pushed me into it.
And then eventually you were around 11 or 12 when you concluded that you're a boy?
I was 12.
So 12 years old, and then you basically went to your parents and told them that you're a boy now?
At first, I decided to start the conversation by writing a letter and just leaving it on the table for them to read, because I didn't really know how I would bring that up face to face, and I knew it would be a big shock for them. I was kind of anticipating a negative reaction, so I kind of wanted to allow them some time to think about it. They knew I was kind of a tomboy, but they never really foresaw anything quite like this. And they wanted to support me. They wanted to get to the bottom of this and understand why I was feeling this way. And they decided that because they weren't really knowledgeable on this topic, that they would take me to therapists, a team of real professionals who could help us out with this. My first therapist, he was like, okay, so I'll refer to you by this name that you prefer and call you their son, call you boy, and things like that. And he never really addressed anything that was going on. It was like he never really probed into like what was going on at home or what was going on at school. It was like he wasn't really doing anything. And he actually, I think he either got fired or transferred out of Kaiser. And I had a new therapist. And then I was also referred to a gender specialist, I think, who did the diagnosis for gender dysphoria. All right, great. So this confirms what I already know. I already know that I'm struggling with these feelings. I already did a little bit of research on transitioning online, both on like social media and more, I guess you'd say, reliable sources like actual medical resources. All of it kind of said the same thing. Like transitioning was really presented as the only means of treating gender dysphoria, and I thought like it was the only way forward, and that I was actually a boy. I tried to talk to my parents about this. I was like, I really want to start taking hormones and go forward with like a medical transition. And at first they did push back. They were like, they didn't really understand why I wanted to do this so much. And they're like, you're quite young and we think that you should wait until you're more competent. And then they had another appointment with the medical professionals, and they were told that, transition is really the only way forward, and that if I wasn't allowed to go through with it, they said that I would be at risk of committing suicide.
Hmm. Was there anybody up until that moment that was kind of chaperoning you through this? Or was it basically you reading things online and forming your thoughts and your plan to write a letter to your parents, to move with the transition? Were you kind of like pushing this alone, or what role did the school play in your life?
I was the only one pushing for this, really. I was basically going off of my own research, and I did have a little bit of influence from other transgender people, but I wasn't like really interacting within the transgender community, and I wasn't pushed into this by anybody. I think one thing that really struck me about other transgender people, especially like the identified teenage girls my age, was that they were people who had their own struggles like I did. A lot of them had like family issues, or they were being abused, or like they had like a single parent. They're just like struggling to become what I thought then to be like the best version of themselves. And with every milestone in their transition, from starting on hormones and getting surgery, they seem to become more complete and more happy with themselves. And I saw over time that like their families started to become more, I guess, accepting of them, and they made friends who really seemed to care about them and have their backs. And as a kid, that wasn't really particularly close to anybody in her life, and didn't really have any friends at school. I was kind of touched by this, and it was something that I really wish that I had for myself.
When your parents and you were meeting with the health practitioners at Kaiser, what was the experience once you started meeting with these professionals?
I think the biggest issue was that there were a lot of things that they didn't tell me or my parents. There are studies that suggest that there's a high rate of desistance amongst minors who identify as the opposite sex. By the time they reach adulthood, the figures are anywhere from like a 60 to 90% rate of desistance and becoming comfortable with one's body and identity and sex. And I didn't know about this. I didn't even consider that as a possibility. And it was never really brought up. When my parents asked about like the regret rates, they were basically like, there's less than a 1 to 2% rate of regret. And they cite studies that are pretty faulty, pretty poorly conducted, and have a pretty high dropout rate. So there really isn't like a whole lot of data on this in the first place. But, you know, I was told, like, the science is there, it's all done, we've been doing this for decades, and it's fairly safe, you know? The first endocrinologist I saw actually was really the only physician to push back on this. He said, like, you're one of the youngest patients I've seen. I don't know how this might go on to affect your brain development going forward, so I think we should pump the brakes and wait a little bit. But I never heard this from any other medical professional ever again. It was like I was just immediately referred to another endocrinologist who, after I think it was 2 or 3 appointments, gave me my mom the consent forms to sign off on. And, you know, these consent forms, they do list, like, the side effects, but they're pretty vague. They're not very comprehensive. And, you know, as I was 13 at this point, and I mean, teens and kids especially have a habit of thinking, like, "Oh, I'm invincible, like, nothing could happen to me." And before I started transitioning, I was, like, a perfectly healthy kid. I didn't consider what could possibly happen to me, really. During those appointments, my endocrinologist asked me, "Are you aware that you may experience, like, vaginal atrophy? Are you aware that this may affect your ability to conceive children as an adult?" And, you know, as a kid, it was just like, "Oh, yeah, yeah, I know. I've done my research." And then, you know, when she told me about the potential impact it might have on my fertility, it was like, "Oh, no, I don't wanna have kids," 'cause I was 13, I was a kid.
Yeah.
Like, how could I know?
What a
I mean,
huge responsibility to put on children to make that decision, right?
yeah. I mean, I was just a kid. There was no way that I would've been thinking about that at the time.
So I'm just curious, how fast does it go from you being 11 years old and thinking, I'm born in the wrong body, to you seeing therapists, then taking hormones, and then going into surgery?
I'd say it was maybe about half a year between me realizing that I felt like I was a boy instead of a girl and coming out to my parents. And then a month or 2 later, I got diagnosed with gender dysphoria. Between the diagnosis for dysphoria and actually being put on hormones, I think it was just another half a year, give or take. So it was pretty quick.
Wow. And then you went on the medication, and what did that feel like?
So it started with the puberty blockers, which they put me on for about a month before starting testosterone to basically clear out the production of the natural sex hormones out of my body to um, make way for the exogenous hormones. And honestly, it sucked. Like, it sucked to be on it alone. Once all, like, the hormones were cleared out of my body, I felt, like, kind of depressed. I didn't have a whole lot of energy, and I also started to experience hot flashes because it's basically like an artificial menopause. They were pretty sporadic, so I didn't really have any way of, like, predicting when they would happen other than, like, my whole body would get itchy, and then all of a sudden, like, I would just the feeling would just, like, flare up, and I would just be really uncomfortably hot, and it was pretty distracting during class or whatever I was trying to focus on at the time. And I also started to get this feeling of pressure in my mid to upper back to my neck, and sometimes, like, I would, if I, like, breathed in deeply enough, I would hear, like, a loud crack.
Hmm.
That stopped happening once I was a few months on testosterone, but since then, I've also developed, like, some joint pains, like, in my elbows, my hands, my knees, and um, my back. You know, once I started on testosterone, it felt great because, you know, I finally had hormones again in my body, and, like, I had, like, my energy back. And there's also just the feeling of, you know, like, this is a big step in my life. This is a big step in the right direction. The physical effects started to come pretty quickly. I'd say after only about, like, a week or two, my voice started to drop pretty dramatically. My features started becoming more squarish, my body fat distribution started to change, and I developed more muscle. Even my hair and my eyebrows were, like, getting thicker. It was just exciting to see all the changes, and I felt confident in myself. I felt like I looked good.
How are you doing in school?
Throughout my school years, I did kind of struggle with school a little bit, mostly just, like, keeping my focus and organization.
And socially?
At this point in time, I didn't really have a whole lot of friends at school because, you know, people at school were, like, noticing my changing presentation, and all the bodily changes and the change in my voice. And, you know, I was in middle school, so not everybody was the nicest about it. How people reacted kind of varied by sex. Like, some of the girls were pretty mean to me over it, and there was a boy who was kind of harassing me throughout the school year as well. But most of the boys just didn't really care at all. The girls seemed more interested in what was going on, but there was an incident towards the end of the school year where one of the boys who had been bullying me that year had actually walked up to me while I was in a classroom, and he assaulted me. He groped my chest. You know, I was in shock, but I kind of just brushed it off. It was like nobody else in the class really seemed to either notice or care, and so maybe it doesn't really matter that much, and I should have, you know, because I wanted to be a boy, it was like I just told myself to man up and get it over with, and I didn't really realize just how much that affected me. And I knew that even if I wanted to speak out, I really couldn't, because if I brought it up to the school office, I knew that they wouldn't really hold him accountable. Like, they would probably just give him a slap on the wrist, and then he would come back maybe like a few days, maybe like a week suspension, and he could potentially do something worse to me. So I felt like it wasn't really worth the trouble of speaking out about it, and so I stayed silent. But it did affect me pretty strongly. I mean, I grew up with a really bad fear of being sexually assaulted, because a lot of the girls that I knew, when they were kids, they were either assaulted or stalked or abused by family members, and I was terrified of having that same thing happen to me. You know, at the time, I was only like 13. I wasn't very developed, and I wore like loose shirts, so I never thought like anybody would really notice that part of me. But that incident just made me very, very conscious of that part of my body, and I wanted to hide it from the world. And so I started binding. I used a compression device called a binder, which is basically like looks like a tank top. It has compression fabric in the chest, and it's for the purpose of basically flattening the breasts and making for a more masculine or androgynous appearance. I bought my first few binders shortly after that, and I used those for about 2 years before I got surgery.
Would you wear them every day? And what
Yeah.
did that feel like?
Yeah, I wore them every time that I went out to school or in public. And, you know, I'd wear them for maybe about like 6 to possibly even 12 hours a day. I would work out in them. I would swim in them. It wasn't very comfortable. I mean,
It doesn't sound very comfortable.
No, it's not. I mean, some people, I thought it was just fine, because some people get like really bad like breast pains or back pains or rib pains or otherwise from wearing them. But I never got that. Like, you know, I thought like it fits well. I bought it from a brand that's supposedly one of the safer brands, so I must be okay. But it actually deformed my ribs over time. You know, because I was still developing. I was still growing. It's kind of a graphic way to describe it, but the way they work, they basically push the breast into the rib cage, and I mean, this causes all sorts of issues. The effect wasn't immediately noticeable to me. I didn't realize this until after my breasts were gone. I was like, "Hey, what's going on with my rib cage? Why is it like flaring out like that?" And I figured out it's because I used the binder while I was growing.
At what point did you decide to go get surgery, and how old were you?
I was 15. I was in my sophomore year by this point. By the time I entered high school, I was already on testosterone for long enough. Nobody really even knew that I was transgender, save for people that I went to elementary school with, or people who I was a bit closer to. Um, but you know, after like a few years of using the binder, it really sucked, and I wanted to stop. I wanted to be free of that, and I really truly believed that I was a boy, that I was just like any other boy my age, and I wanted to look like other boys and be able to like take my shirt off without worrying.
What is the process from making a decision that you don't want to have the breasts anymore to actually going to surgery. So did you meet with a pediatrician or do you go directly to a surgeon? How does that work?
So I first talked about this with my therapist, I believe. I was referred to another gender specialist who then sent me to a gender-affirming surgeon. When I had an appointment with the surgeon, when I was waiting in the office, they had like pictures of post-op results of their, they called it TopSurgery. It's really a double mastectomy. It was, it was all like people who were pretty well healed, like all things considered, like their scars and everything looked just fine.
And it
There
seems
was
like they were doing a lot of them. I mean, was it like, oh, there are a
yeah,
whole bunch of people here
yeah,
who
yeah.
are
There was like a lot
removing
of
their
pictures.
breasts?
There was a lot of pictures up. It kind of reinforced this idea that it was just like part of the process and just
Oh, a
a
lot of people
normal
are
thing.
doing it. Yeah.
Yeah. After that appointment with the surgeon, he was like, "Hey, you may want to attend this top surgery classroom that takes place in the hospital building." And I said, "Okay." And I went to it. It was basically for minors and their parents to attend to learn more about top surgery and all the different kinds of incisions and how it works. And
I was
it
just going to
was,
ask you that. Were there a lot of other minors there getting top
yeah,
surgery or breast removal?
yeah. It kind of shocked me, attending that class actually, because as soon as I sat down, I like looked around the room and I noticed there were maybe like 12 to 15 other girls in there. And I noticed like pretty young, and most of them looked to be much earlier in the process than I was. I don't think most of them were even on hormones yet. And they were already considering surgery. That was kind of a shock to me, but it was also, well, I guess I'm not the only one.
Yeah, I guess that's the feeling that they kind of want to give to you,
Yeah.
right? And so you spoke with your parents and together you decided to move forward
Mhm.
with the surgery. And then once you had the surgery, what were you happy then? What was it what you were hoping to achieve?
I remember the day of, I was pretty excited. Like it was a big step for me. And I remember being wheeled into the operating room and I was pretty nervous. I still felt pretty confident about it, It was like I didn't have any doubts about it until after it happened. But there was like a young male nurse in the back of the room, um, preparing something, and I saw him like look back at me, and he looked very, very concerned, kind of like, "What am I doing? How old is that kid? That's a kid right there." I didn't really understand what his face meant at the time, but
I guess you look back now and you remember the original doctor and some of the nurses looking at things and thinking that it's strange and now it's kind of coming back to you.
yeah, I was pretty confident that this was going to work out for me, and I was looking forward to it. And when I woke up and all the medication wore off and I was ready to move around and go home, it was like, wow, I feel great. Like I'm so happy. By this point, it was a major surgery on the upper part of my body, so I lost a considerable amount of my range of motion. I couldn't even lift my arms up until like 2 or 3 months after the fact. And after that period, I had to get my stitches taken out, and it was like, the surgery had severed a lot of nerve endings and blood vessels, so the sensation was not quite right. It was very numb, but I could still feel like everything that was happening, and it made me physically sick having to deal with that. I mean, I got really nauseous when they were doing that. We had to stop midway through, and then once I got home and I had to start bathing again, it also meant that I had to start taking care of these incisions and wounds on my chest, and it was hard just to take my shirt off, take the compression device off, and remove and reapply all the dressings and just see what was underneath. I could barely look at myself. The the post-op period has been pretty rough, and I don't think it's anything that any 15-year-old should have to go through, frankly. But I also missed out on a few events and social opportunities like parties and group outings and stuff like that. And I just couldn't leave the house because I was basically disabled. I wasn't really in a state to be going out on my own like that. And it really sucked. And I started to feel the sense of isolation. And during my next school year, COVID came up and they started doing all the lockdowns and distance learning and stuff like that. And that really reinforced the feeling of isolation that was already there tenfold. And, I started to withdraw because I wasn't really interacting with the outside world and I couldn't really go out. And I started using the internet a lot more often. I started being exposed to these images of other women again. And subconsciously I started to realize I miss looking feminine. I miss looking pretty, and didn't realize it at the time, but I was starting to regret my transition. I didn't like the way that testosterone was making me look anymore, and I wished for a more feminine form. And I secretly started to buy makeup and skirts and women's clothing again. I would just wear it in my room without anybody really knowing. I wouldn't tell anybody about it because I was so ashamed of myself. It was a hard thing to admit. But I didn't really fully realize my regret with my transition until 11 months after my surgery. I was in a lot of distress by this point. I wasn't really performing well at school. I was starting to not really even attend my online classes, so my parents decided to put me in a different program for school. One of the lessons I had was on child development, child psychology, and maternity. And I learned that breastfeeding was not only a means of feeding your child, but it's also one of the main ways that as a mother you bond with your kid. And I never really thought about this before. This was really the first time that I ever really thought about being a parent, even because I was a kid when I consented to all of this, and I wasn't really focused on things like that. I was worried about school or fitting in or getting my assignments in, but I never really thought about how being a parent would look for me one day. Deep down, I had a maternal instinct that wasn't really fostered at all because I was being socialized as a boy. I believed myself to be a boy, and I was developing like a boy because I was on cross-sex hormones. I started to realize what was really taken from me.
Wow.
I realized one day that I really regretted my entire transition, every single step of it, from the hormones to the blockers and the surgery especially, because that was the most irreversible part about it. And I didn't really know what life would look like for me going forward, because I knew that much of my transition was going to be irreversible. I didn't even know if I was ever going to look like a woman again, and I just didn't know what to do with myself. I just broke down crying, and I called a friend of mine to talk about it, and I wanted to talk to my mom about it. I couldn't bear to do that face to face though, because I didn't want her to see me with the tears streaming down my face and the stress that I was in. I had a lot of shame and guilt about this because, it was this thing that I was invested in for so long, and everybody around me knew me as their son or their brother or just a boy, and I no longer looked like a woman. I didn't know. It was hard to admit that I was wrong, and especially when everybody else around me supported me. I didn't know what to do. I just stopped taking the hormones, and I just kind of stayed confined to my room and my bed. It did help that my mom and dad would come to my door to check in on me and bring me food and snacks, things like that. It was comforting, and I think that was one of the biggest things that kept me going.
They supported you no matter what.
And, I didn't really have any friends in person by this point. The lockdowns and distance learning had basically torn apart all my friendships, and the only friends I really had anymore were online. And I would talk about my my feelings online, about regretting my transition, how I hated how it made me look and how it made me feel. I was kind of shocked because I was actually met with a lot of hatred from other transgender individuals.
Your friends online were transgender
Yeah.
individuals, part of a transgender community?
Yeah, I had friends who were kind of all over the board. A lot of people who were straight, gay, transgender, conservative, liberal.
And so when you told them that you regretted what you were doing, what was their reaction?
I mean, I had a few friends who actually saw this coming and they felt guilty for not speaking up. A lot of my other transgender friends, I think it's kind of like awoken like a new fear in them, because most of my friends who identified as transgender were either like very early in the process, like they were only socially transitioning, they weren't on any hormones yet, or they were just starting on hormones. So seeing somebody like me who transitioned young and was so far into it, I think that was kind of terrifying for them. And there was also like a little bit of jealousy because of that, I think. And some people decided that they just couldn't handle these feelings and that they would attack me over it. I was told things like, "Oh, you weren't a kid. You knew exactly what you were doing to yourself. You were informed. This wasn't an experiment. You weren't wronged. You did this to yourself." They told me that if I kept talking about this, then it would make everybody else uncomfortable, and it wasn't bringing any benefit to anybody. It would just damage the community of real transgender people with real dysphoria. And I stopped speaking out about it. But during that period of time, though, I was also starting to naturally question like what happened and challenge my own views. And I was also interacting with other people online who either desisted or they stopped transitioning after a medical transition, or they're in the middle of like questioning their transition. And I realized like this isn't as uncommon as I thought it was. And this is a very real thing that's happening. And now that I'm going through it myself, I'm being silenced. And that's not okay. I realized what was going on, and I stopped giving in to the pressure of other people, and I started speaking about it again, at first on my social media and to friends and family, and eventually I decided to start speaking out on Twitter publicly.
In what ways were you being silenced, and what are you doing to kind of push against that?
It was mostly social pressure from other transgender people, and even some individuals who call themselves like gay or trans allies. People who had never been through the process telling me like, "You're being a TERF, you're being a transphobe, you're bigoted, you need to
Or
stop
they're
this
like
right now."
dismissing you or
Yeah.
something. At first, they're the most tolerant people in the world, and suddenly they're like so intolerant because they don't like what you're saying
Yep.
now. Yeah. And so you've taken on a big responsibility now to try to help others through the pain that you went through. I just think you're so amazing. It's hard to believe that you're 18 now.
Yeah.
You're 18. It's just hard to believe you're so young, but you've taken on a big responsibility, and through the adversity and pain that you went through, you found strength, which I think is so incredible. I mean, first of all, you're beautiful.
Thank you.
I'm just going to say that. And secondly, you're also beautiful inside, because it takes a lot of courage to do what you're doing. I know you're getting a lot of heat and pressure. And so just tell me, what are you hoping to achieve now with this new journey that you're going on?
The system that's in place right now, the affirmative care system, it's very one size fits all. There's never like any regards to any alternatives to transitioning or treating dysphoria. And that's what leads to cases like mine. They're not really considering like any comorbidities. Like I didn't even know that I was autistic until after I stopped transitioning. And over the course of my transition, I actually developed more psychiatric issues. There needs to be a better assessment for who transition would work out for and who it might not. And I really don't think that it's something that children can consent to. I mean, it's something that affects pretty much every area of your life. I mean, even in ways you wouldn't even think of. Even if they did give me like the full picture of what could happen to me, I wouldn't really have been able to really fully comprehend what it all meant. I didn't really have the mental faculties or life experience to be able to make that kind of decision. It affects every area of your health, from your general health to your reproductive health and your sexual function. Children just aren't really equipped to be able to do that kind of thing.
And you're suing Kaiser.
Yes.
Tell me a little bit about the lawsuit.
I'm suing for negligence and medical malpractice. what they did to me was wrong, and it's most certainly not for children. And on top of that, I wasn't fully informed of the full extent of how transition could affect me.
How can we help you? How can the people who are listening help you?
I think the most important thing to do is to just keep spreading the word about what's going on.
How are you funding this lawsuit? It must be incredibly expensive to sue Kaiser.
I do have a donation fund set up.
It's like a GoFundMe or something.
It's on my my attorney's website, I believe.
Mm-hmm. Another part of what I'd love to know is there's the court of law and there is the court of public opinion, and you're doing both, right? You're suing them in the court of law, but you're also speaking about your experience. And can people follow you? You have like an Instagram.
I do have Instagram and YouTube, but my main platform is Twitter. My username is CHOOCOLE.
And are you planning on going back to school?
I do want to go to college. I am taking one class right now, but I do want to take more classes, and I think I want to eventually go on to get a degree. I'm not really sure what, I mean, I just don't really know what I want to do yet. There's so many possibilities.
So normal for an 18-year-old. I mean, what you're already doing is so much bigger than what any 18-year-old would do.
And I like doing it.
Yeah. You and I had a conversation just before we sat down as we were walking in here, and I think is one that's really worth sharing with people out there. And that is, when you're a young girl, but even a grown woman, you can't expect to look at yourself all the time and feel like you're everything you were hoping you would see, right?
Especially in the age of social media.
Exactly. I mean, I look in the mirror and I'm critical of myself. And so this idea that you can look at yourself and just see everything you're hoping that you would see as you see on social media, and then live in this kind of, alternative virtual reality, it is no wonder why young folks are struggling like that. And so the idea that people are turning immediately to surgery or changing their gender is so dangerous. And I want anybody who is listening to us to know that from both of our experiences, mine a little longer than yours, none of us can always feel like we're everything we're hoping that we would look for. And that is not even something that we should strive towards.
Absolutely.
We should strive towards being happy with who we are, with the gifts that God has given us. And this whirlpool that you stepped into because you were looking at yourself and you were looking at the images on social and saying, well, I want to look like that. And if I don't look like that, I'm therefore not a woman, is so wrong. There is no woman out there, not even a supermodel, who looks at herself and says, I'm this perfect looking being. Nobody feels that way. And so if you're listening to this conversation, I want you to know that nobody ever feels like they look perfect. And that is totally fine, because we don't need to look perfect. And we should certainly not think that we need to change our gender because we don't look like some avatar on social media.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest faults of our world today is that we've become very focused on vanity rather than things that really matter, like our contributions to the world around us and our communities and our families.
Exactly. Well, I want to thank you so much for your openness and your courage. You're incredible. You're just incredible. And so thank you so much. And I hope you give a lot of courage to other young women out there.
Thank you so much for having me here.
Thank you.